Bueno, buenos días a todos. Quiero agradecer a la Asociación Médica del Hospital por darnos la oportunidad de tener esta sesión del servicio de cardiología. Para mí es un honor presentar el día de hoy al doctor David Majure. Él es cardiólogo, especialista en insuficiencia cardíaca y trasplante. Actualmente es el coordinador del área de falla cardíaca y trasplante en el Hospital Weill Cornell, Nueva York. Él, la verdad es que ya hemos tenido experiencia platicando con él, conviviendo. Ayer estuvo con los residentes, es una persona muy amigable, con muchísima experiencia y que sobre todo estos temas complejos los aterriza de una forma muy fácil. Entonces vamos a dar inicio a la sesión del día de hoy con el tema que es Past, Present and Future, The Innovative Spirit of Heart Transplantation. Por favor, Dr. David, please.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Manuel. Es un gran placer de estar aquí. Voy a hablar en inglés, que es un poco más fácil con este tema para mí. A ver. There are just so many fascinating things right now happening in heart transplant. And I was just talking about how it's fascinating within the space because everything changes so rapidly, our interest. For a long time, LVADs occupied all the research. Whenever we go to our international meetings, everybody was talking about the progress in LVADs, where we were going, and it seemed like research on transplant was kind of dead. And then about 8 years ago, everything changed. We developed new technologies, new ways to make lives of patients easier, new ways to minimize graft dysfunction after transplant. And I'm going to just share some of those with you today. Basically what I'm talking about. And I have no disclosures of note. I'm not funded by anybody. So this, and we have one of our esteemed surgeons here in the audience. This is a simple slide for how you do a transplant. And I put it here kind of as a joke because Yoshi Naka, who is my surgeon that I work with, who is a very well-known surgeon throughout the world. When I give lectures on heart transplant to the cardiothoracic surgery fellows, he says, well, this is all it is. And he just kind of leaves it at that. It's a little joke. Obviously, it's far harder than that, far harder than that. But the point is that heart transplant care is a very complicated thing that goes well beyond the transplant itself. It is about delivering the patient to the surgeon in the best state possible so that we can avoid complications. It's about having a multidisciplinary team during the surgery to ensure that we have the best outcome possible. And importantly, it's all the care that follows thereafter. And so it's a team approach, everybody working together to ensure that we have the best outcome possible for our patient. So as you all know, cardiovascular disease is overtaking the world in terms of not only death, but also the quality of life that it burdens the entire planet. This is just recently published in JACC, looking at the burden or the disability adjusted life years in various countries around the world. And you can see that cardiovascular disease it's everywhere. There was a time maybe 30 years ago where Africa would not have looked like this. It would have been all infectious disease. But the transition towards cardiovascular disease is claiming a burden is immense. And where I live in New York, not only do we have a high burden of cardiovascular disease that leads to early mortality, there's a wide range and disparity that we have to deal with. In New York, we have people from all over the world, but a wide range of economic statuses leading to great disparities. And you see this not only in the regional boroughs, whether it be in Staten Island or Brooklyn or up in the Bronx, but also at the level of different racial and ethnic profiles where the burdens vary. These are some of the things that we need to address. And before I launch into transplant, I'll say that there is so much that we could do to prevent so many of these patients from leading to advanced heart failure and dying prematurely. We have great medications, but even more than that, we need to construct a society where we're preventing these diseases to begin with. That takes a lot of work and a lot of political willpower. So I'm just going to start off with a case. We were just talking about how the impact of some of the congenital heart disease is going to take a bigger role. And actually, I was seeing some of the congenital heart disease clinic here yesterday. And as those patients get older, well, they're going to develop heart failure earlier. And this was a guy, really awesome guy, 42-year-old with a congenitally corrected TGA. He had his first surgery at age 2 on the Columbia campus of New York Presbyterian. And he did pretty well, but around age 34, he developed worsening valvular insufficiency, and he had a systemic AV valve replacement as well as a tricuspid valve replacement. He was a competitive tennis player, and he was on the tennis courts just a few years later, and he developed ventricular fibrillation while playing tennis, declined further. We ended up putting him on milrinone and ultimately got him listed for transplant. So at the time of transplant, he was on milrinone, a little bit of metoprolol, and a eplerenone. As you might expect, since this was a third-time redo sternotomy, the dissection was very difficult. He had a large clot within his left atrium. It was evacuated without a problem. Because of the dissection time, the cold ischemic time was quite long at 5 hours and 2 minutes. But the sizing was good. It's only a few centimeters difference in height by the donor and the recipient. The weight was a little bit heavier in the donor or lighter in the donor than recipient. And the predicted heart mass, which is one of the ways that we can think about size matching, was on the lower side, but the heart size was actually quite on the larger side. So we thought it was a good fit. So this is the surgery. Here we're using the Sherpa pack, which is a way that I'm going to talk about this. One of the ways that we now transport the hearts for preserved, better preservation. This is Dr. Naka here and Dr. Warku performing the transplant itself. And this is just showing some of the hemodynamics after transplant. So tachycardic, but as we expect, but relatively good filling pressures here, very good biventricular function. Now, he was extubated within 12 hours after transplant, and this is actually less than a day after transplant. He's already up and walking. We got him off inotropes within 7 days, had him on the standard immunosuppression, and a year later, he was back to playing competitive tennis. Now, because we're in Mexico and you guys like soccer, I just want to briefly show you this is another just great case. This is a year and 3 months after this guy's transplant. He was from Algeria. I met him about 8 years ago, probably had myocarditis. And he loved soccer. Actually, even with an 8-centimeter ventricle, he was playing soccer competitively. I would do annual CPETs on him to make sure he could still handle it, but eventually he had a decline like people do. Got transplanted, and here he competed in the World Transplant Olympics. I don't know if y'all even knew this existed. This was in Italy. Let's see if I can get this to start here. It should start automatically. ¿Puede empezar el video? Hay un modo de hacer de empezarlo. No sé si... ahí está.
Now trying the counter-attack with Shimizu. Let's go to Kimrian. Kimrian, 1-2 for Shimizu. That's good. The second goal for USA, 7-2.
So, anyway, it's just great to see what people can do when you have a really good, successful transplant, especially in these younger patients. They can return to an amazing quality of life, and it's quite impressive. So this is the first transplant. In 1967, the patient was Louis Washkansky, and done in South Africa. And it was a successful transplant in the sense that the patient did make it through the transplant, but unfortunately died about 7 days later due to a pulmonary infection. But it really started this process. And Christian Bernard, who did that transplant, really became a superstar. He was dating models, driving Ferraris in Italy. He even wrote a really racy novel about a doctor and a nurse. He eventually kind of went into plastic surgery. He was a fascinating guy, a little crazy. But it started this whole process of transplant. But then unfortunately, several years later, there was actually a panel before Congress because so many patients were dying very quickly. And the thought was that the promise of transplant was quickly following into the reality that these patients don't do well when they don't have adequate immunosuppression, because we didn't have adequate immunosuppression, it didn't exist. But as we developed better immunosuppressive therapies, the survival improved significantly. And if we look at modern survival, this is looking at outcomes up to 1 year after transplant and looking at survival across different eras. So this blue line represents patients transplanted from 1992 to 2000, and the brown line is 2018 to 2023. And you'll notice that survival has progressively improved, although the primary benefits in survival are upfront improvements. So people are just not dying early on. But we haven't really changed the slope thereafter. So we have a lot to do to improve the death of patients subsequently. But currently, average survival for patients is around 13 to 14 years, which is pretty good return on people who otherwise would probably die within months. But we can probably still make ongoing progress. So this is just looking at some of the changing demographics in people that we are transplanting. Years ago, ischemic cardiomyopathy, which is represented in these red bars, was really the dominant nature of how people develop worsening heart failure syndromes. But now, much more of the patients that are getting transplanted are non-ischemic cardiomyopathy, probably reflective of the fact that we're doing a better job treating ischemic cardiomyopathy, whether it be with statins or CABG or early PCI and such. So less patients are coming into transplant with ischemic cardiomyopathy and more with non-ischemic cardiomyopathy. The number of transplants has also increased. Now, when I started in this, there really was very flat. There was no growth at all in the number of people being transplanted, but there was a big change around 2013, primarily in the United States. This is North America, so it's the US and Canada, but honestly, it's almost entirely the US because there aren't very many transplants done in Canada. But the blue bars here represent the transplant volume in Europe, and this is the rest of the world. This is out of the international consortium out of ISHLT. But you'll notice that the transplant rates increased quite a bit in the US. And you might say, well, why is that? Well, one, we started forming much better multidisciplinary heart failure teams to identify these patients. But another reality is that there were a lot more donors in the US, somewhat because the drug epidemic in the US led to much, much higher donor rates. And we were able to transplant people because there were just a lot more donors. Interestingly, right now, that has decreased significantly. There's hardly any more fentanyl overdoses in the US, which has changed dramatically our ability to get donors for hearts. So we have to think about ways to improve donor allocation. So the system in the US for how you get a heart transplant, and this is different for different organs, but with heart transplant, we are interested in transplanting the patients who have the highest or the greatest degree of illness, those that are most likely to die. We want to save those people first. Now, obviously, you don't want to wait till a person is so sick that when they arrive in the OR that they're going to die anyway. That's not our goal. But we want to prioritize the people that are sicker because they stand to benefit the most. Now, prior to 2018, this was the system that we had where the people at the highest part of the list were called 1A, but we didn't really do a good job discriminating between who was sick. So you could be 1A and be on ECMO, or you could be 1A and be on a balloon pump, or you could be on just inotropes with a swan and with a PA catheter in. So you could be on 2.5 of dobutamine, maybe 0.2 of milrinone with a swan in. And as far as the system looked, you were just as sick as somebody with ECMO. Not a very good system. And so as a result, it was very difficult to transplant people who were very sick, and they almost always went for an LVAD instead of going for a transplant. And then they would wait for an LVAD until the LVAD had a problem, and then they would get transplanted. So we realized that that was not a very good system. And so our new system does a better job of discriminating who's sick. So the very sickest are those that are on ECMO, who are on non-dischargeable BiVAD. So maybe they have Centromags with both an LVAD and RVAD support, kind of like the cases we were talking about yesterday, or they've got some sort of durable mechanical circulatory support with, so let's say like VT or something. In contrast, people that are at home on inotropes or have a left ventricular assist device and are stable otherwise, they're all the way down at status 4. And so this did a better job, at least, of discriminating. And, oh, actually, last thing. And so we also put in the system of saying, objectively if they were in shock or not, so that centers couldn't just say, well, my patient is in shock, therefore they should be status 2. There are actual criteria. And in order to get on the list at that level, you actually have to fill out this form, and it has very hard stop rules. So if you don't meet those criteria, you can't be within that status. And so, for instance, if you measure their hemodynamics within 7 days before being on ECMO or some other sort of temporary mechanical support, and they have a low cardiac index not on inotropes, or a little bit higher cardiac index on inotropes, and a high wedge and a low blood pressure, well, they meet those criteria. Anyway, the point is just to say that there are very strict criteria for achieving these statuses. And so how well did it work? Well, this is this dark line here is before the policy change, and this is after the policy change. And so we found that people waited on the waiting list less time after the policy change. So we were transplanting them more rapidly, and looking at the likelihood of being transplanted before and after the policy change, they were more likely to be transplanted. So less time on the waiting list and more likely to be transplanted. And the survival was equivalent between the two eras. So that seems pretty good, but we've identified that there's still a lot of problems. For instance, when this system was changed, it doesn't really lead to a good pathway for patients who are on durable LVAD to be transplanted unless they have a really bad problem with the LVAD. But the modern LVADs, the HeartMate 3, quite frankly, they work really well. They're just a lot less problems. We don't have pump thrombosis anymore. GI bleeding is much less. The risk of strokes is much less. And so people can live on the LVAD for a really long time. For some people, that's really good. For some people, it feels a little bit like a prison. So one of the things that was really interesting was that our behavior changed after the institution of the system, because now we had a pathway for, if we put in a balloon pump, or if we put on an Impella, or if we put patients on ECMO, we could get them transplanted more easily. So it changed behavior with how we took care of the patients. And so this is right where the change happened. The blue line represents people on temporary MCS waiting for transplant, and the red bar represents people on ECMO. So all of a sudden, you saw a surge in the number of people on temporary mechanical circulatory support. Now, this also coincided with the development of the Impella 5.5, which is compared to the prior Impellas, which caused a lot of hemolysis, a lot of limb ischemia. They couldn't last for very long. You can put an Impella 5.5 in and leave it in for months. And sometimes we have done so in order to get a person to transplant. Now, whether or not this is a good thing or not is up for debate, but we were able to get people transplanted more easily, and also in a much more hemodynamically stable case. With an Impella 5.5, you can walk if it's in the axillary position every day, get up and walk. You can wean off the inotropes. You can have them in a much better position when they arrive in the OR. Now, what about procurement? Some fascinating things have been happening in procurement. But let's first start with talking about why the nature of procurement is so important. And a lot of it gets to this. This is a person in the OR right after the transplant, and this heart does not look very good. This is right after transplant. This is primary graft dysfunction. The ventricle, the left ventricle in particular, is dilated. The right ventricle is also dilated. There's a lot of mitral regurgitation, and both are very hypocontractile. This patient we put on ECMO in the OR after the transplant and brought them back to the unit. And with careful weaning of support and just management, after 4 days, we're able to wean the patient off of ECMO. Now you can see there's still some ventricular dysfunction here. There's a little bit of hypocontractility in the septum and in the anterior wall. But this patient has done very well and is now 3 years post-transplant with good organ function and a great quality of life. So if you support them well, you can get through it, but it's a very fatal condition. In fact, it's the leading cause of 30-day mortality following heart transplant. And so we want to do everything we can to minimize the risk of primary graft dysfunction. And primary graft dysfunction is a very complicated process. A lot of it has to do with the ischemic reperfusion injury that also follows, once again, the way that we procure the hearts and the way that we transport the hearts. But as you can see here by this diagram, there's lots of stuff going on, which I won't really get into. Now, once again, the hazard of death is greatest within the first 60 to 90 days. And so we want to look for opportunities to reduce that. So what are some of the factors for primary graft dysfunction? So this is maybe a bit of a list, but one of them, for example, is older age of donors. And we increasingly are having to go to older donors. In Europe, it's very common to get donors that are in their 50s. Now they have the survival in Europe is much lower than in the US. Maybe it is related to the fact that they do take these older donors. Once again, up till this decrease in the current fentanyl epidemic, I rarely took a donor that was over the age of 50. And the mean age of donors in the United States was around 35 years of age. But now, the last several months, we've been taking donors up to around 58 or 59 years of age, as long as they didn't have other significant comorbidities. But there might be costs to that in the long run. So gender mismatch, the cause of death itself can be important. If they're on high levels of inotropic or vasopressor support, obviously if there's cardiac dysfunction. From the recipient side, age is also important. The number of sternotomies where they have congenital heart disease. Things like if they're using amiodarone, which we think might decrease the contractile force of the newly transplanted heart because the serum levels of amiodarone are so high in the recipient. Obviously, important issues like how long they're on cardiopulmonary bypass, the ischemic time, all of these are very important. So also, we're traveling farther than we were before. This new system that we have allows us to get hearts from farther distances that maybe aren't placed for whatever reason in their local areas. And we will go about 1,500 nautical miles. We don't go much farther than that. Depends on how fast the jet is and the type of procurement that you're able to utilize, which I'm going to talk about in a second. So there's this relatively new international consortium on primary graft dysfunction, which is intending to really tease out exactly what's happening with primary graft dysfunction. And we still have an awful lot to learn, but you'll notice some of the primary things that show up in this analysis, which is a univariate analysis. So dialysis pre-transplant, probably just a marker of the sickness of the patient. If they had an LVAD pre-transplant is also associated. I'm having a hard time with this pointer. Okay. Whether they had an LVAD pre-transplant is also associated with primary graft dysfunction, probably through a variety of mechanisms. The ischemic time and once again, the donor age come up as markers. Now, as I said before, the timing of ECMO is really important. And this is a series that came out of our center back in 2019, looking at early implantation of ECMO post-operatively, or really intraoperatively, rather than waiting for them to come out of the OR, see how they're doing, and then go, oh, well, they're not doing very well. I'm going to bring them back to the OR and put them on ECMO or place ECMO there. And even though the findings here are not significant because it's a relatively low number of patients, you'll notice, at least visually, that the curves are quite different in terms of the likelihood of survival in the patients who are placed on ECMO quickly versus those patients who are placed in ECMO after leaving the OR and coming back. And by living and coming back, I'm talking about within 12 hours. So all these people went back quite quickly, but even then there was a big difference. So what about preservation? So one of the newest things that we have is the Sherpa pack. And this is the story behind this is fascinating and just a great example of somebody who was very curious, saw a problem and fixed it. She wasn't even involved in transplant. She was doing research at MGH in glucose disorders and wanted a pancreas from one of the OPOs, the places where they procure the organs. She goes, well, if you don't use a pancreas, just bring it to me and then I can do my own work on it. And so she got it, but it was in a box with ice and it was all very cold and frozen. And she goes, well, next time you bring me a pancreas, why don't you bring it to me the same way you would bring it to the surgeons? And they were like, well, this is how we bring it to the surgeons. She was like, well, that's crazy. It's all frozen and must have a lot of burn. So she went and created this device. She quit her job and she just made this whole company. I mean, it's just nuts. I love it. That is innovation. But anyway, so what does it do? So it maintains the heart between a very precise temperature of 4 to 8 degrees Celsius. And that allows homogeneous temperature control of the heart muscle. When you have it just in an ice cooler, the outside might be a little bit colder than the inner parts. It's kind of like when you're cooking a steak. You might not get all the meat at the same temperature. So it minimizes cold injury, and they also have a solution that helps to better maintain phosphate stores, which is very important in the whole ischemia reperfusion process. And so the heart is just suspended like that. Now, we don't have the greatest data with this. The study that was done was not a randomized prospective trial, but rather using historical controls going backwards, but match 1-to-1. So this is just one of the early things, just looking at survival probability. Once again, relatively small numbers, so difficult to show significance, but at least visually, you get a sense that survival might be improved if you are looking at people with the Sherpa pack versus standard ice storage. And this is a propensity matched model as well. So it's at least interesting or suggestive. But one thing that looks particularly interesting is that the risk of graft dysfunction appears to be much less sensitive to the ischemic time. And so, whereas with standard ice cold storage, as you have longer and longer ischemic time, that means time where you're not circulating blood through the heart, the risk of PGD goes up quite quickly. But with the Sherpa pack, that risk is much more flat. Once again, we're going farther. We're longer distances to get these organs. And also, if you have a complex dissection, like the patient that I showed you in the first example, it just affords you a little bit more time. And anecdotally, the surgeons will tell you that the tissue just looks a little bit better. It's just less pink. And so in our patients that we are doing standard procurement, we no longer use the ice storage. We only use the Sherpa pack. Let's see, how much time do I have here? Okay, got to make sure I'm on time. I have a lot of stuff I want to share here. So this is just another evaluation of it, showing in a multivariate logistic regression analysis that Sherpa pack seem to be significantly associated with a decreased risk for severe primary graft dysfunction, which we find very important. And this is getting at the idea of the improvements in the so-called extended criteria donors. Those are donors that maybe they have a little bit of a hypocontractility of their heart or they're farther away. And the Sherpa pack appeared to perform quite, The Sherpa pack appeared to perform quite well there. So the patients who had either a long ischemic time or had sorry, the pointer's not working well, seem to have a very good reduction in the risk of PGD. So once again, it just affords us a little more flexibility in the way that we procure and transport the hearts. So one of the newest issues that has developed is our ability to procure hearts via donation after circulatory death. So just to refresh everybody on this, the vast majority of transplants up to this point have been done in donors who are declared brain dead, which, as you know, is a very, it's a legal definition where you have parameters that define you as neurologically deceased, but the heart is still beating and the organs are still perfused. And so the vast majority of transplants, they're brain dead. You go to the OR, the dead donor is in the OR, you prepare the organs and you cross clamp, drain the blood from the heart, put in cardioplegic solution, and you procure the heart and then put it in the box like the Sherpa pack or cold storage. And that's the way we've done it for a long time. And it had doing that, there's not a lot of warm ischemic time, meaning time that the heart is not on ice. And there's a very clear ethical framework that has been established for this. When brain death became an issue, there were actually panels in the US, Congress got involved. There were community meetings about it just to make sure that everybody was in accord with the idea of the concept of brain death. Now, there's this other idea of deceased after circulatory death, and that's where a person has maybe they've got some brain injury, maybe they have some other thing that will be fatal, but they're being maintained alive on life support. So they're not dead, but they're going to die when you withdraw life support. And the family has decided they want to withdraw life support, but the person is also a donor. And so what you can do is you take them into a room, no surgeons are present at that moment, and you withdraw life support and you allow the person to die naturally. Once they are declared dead, then after a period of standoff and make sure that they don't spontaneously start beating their heart again, you can go into the room and procure the organs. We haven't been able to do this historically with heart because that leads to a lot of warm ischemia, meaning time where the heart is hypoxic and you can have more necrosis of the muscle and it doesn't work as well. But we have a couple of ways we've been able to get around with this, which I'm going to share to you. But some of the issues that happen is that they don't necessarily always die right away. We need them, they have to pass away in order for this to be a functioning system within about an hour or two. But sometimes you don't predict it correctly and they continue to live. Sometimes if it takes a long time for them to actually pass away, there might be a prolonged period where the heart is hypoxic and you start to have more damage. And in the particular case of normothermic regional perfusion, which I'm going to describe in just a second, the ethical framework is a little bit less clear. So this is a schema of what this looks like. And so you withdraw life support, and usually they become hypoxic very quickly. And then sometimes the period for them to become hypotensive might take a while, but it oftentimes looks like this. They'll become hypotensive, and maybe they become a little bit less hypotensive. And when they have been through this agonal phase and it's been prolonged enough that death is declared, then there's this mandatory observation period that's usually for about 5 minutes. When they don't have spontaneous recirculation during that time, the team can enter the room and then they can make the incision. Now, at this point, there are two things that can happen. One thing is called normothermic regional perfusion. And you can actually start the patient on ECMO, or the deceased donor on ECMO. Now that obviously creates a problem because you're trying to reanimate the heart, but you may also send blood flow to the brain. And so as a result, you cross-clamp the carotid arteries to prevent any blood flow to the brain and reanimating and delivering blood flow to the brain. Then you monitor the heart on ECMO, remove ECMO, make sure that the heart is still working, and then you procure the heart in the standard fashion. So there's been a lot of debate over whether or not that's ethical or not. You have somebody who presumably has said that they're a donor. They've accepted that concept. They're going to probably die anyway. But could you potentially be getting blood back to the brain? Are you clearly defining them as dead? This has led some hospitals in the US to say that this is ethical and other hospitals to not. So for instance, in New York, we have 7 heart transplant centers. About half of us say that it's ethical and about half of us say it's not that clear. So I'm at one of those centers that said it's not that clear yet. And more than anything, I think the important thing is that if you do this stuff, you need to educate the public, because if the public is not in agreement with it, then you got a big problem. And quite frankly, we didn't do a good job of educating the public. And there were some articles that released in the New York Times a few months ago where there was an example in Kentucky where they got through this phase, the chest was opened and the heart was still beating. And so that's not a good situation. Another situation happened where they removed life support and the person woke up and got off the table and got discharged. This is not a good system, right? So clearly we need to do, that's unusual, obviously, but the point is that we need to have a better system if we're going to do this, because especially in the US, where conspiracy theories and distrust of the system run rampant, that's a great way to shut down transplant everywhere, because who's going to want to be an organ donor if they're not sure that you're going to be taking care of them appropriately? So there's a lot that we need to do there. But that being said, this is one of the things that can happen. So we take the person into the room. We always have a text chain. There's multiple people on this. We're watching what happens. And they'll give us a minute by minute what's happening with the blood pressure. And here you can see this person became very hypoxic very quickly and became quite hypotensive. But then as time went by, their blood pressure came back up. They're still hypoxic, but an hour passes, an hour and a half, and they still haven't been declared. So we aborted it. This shows how we're not always very good at predicting if they're going to die or not. So this is just kind of a model of these different ways of getting to procurement. So this normothermic regional perfusion, which once again is where you get on ECMO, and then you procure the heart directly. Not as expensive. It requires a dedicated team. So you have to send a team of your own surgeons over there with an ECMO circuit in order to do it. In contrast, we have the OCS system, which is what I'm going to show you in just a second, where instead of using the ECMO, they're declared dead, the chest is open, you're not reanimating the heart, but you take the heart out of the body and then you reanimate it on a machine. And that's called the organ care system by Transmedics. It's very expensive, though. It costs about $120,000 to use that machine, not including all the other costs. Now, just recently, the group out of Vanderbilt, which is a very high volume center in Tennessee, developed a different approach. So, and this is very provocative. So instead of putting the donor on ECMO or on the OCS machine, they deliver a ultra oxygenated perfusate solution into the coronaries right after opening the chest. They procure the heart and they just put it on a standard storage device. And that is not very expensive at all. And they just published in JAMA just a few weeks ago their preliminary results up to just shy of 1 year, showing a 1-year survival of around 90%, which is not all that different than the average survival across the countries in standard circumstances. So if this system actually ends up being an accurate way of doing it, it could avoid the high cost of the OCS and avoid the ethical questions of reanimating the heart with ECMO. So this is just a schematic showing how each of these systems, this is out of that JAMA article, showing how each of these systems would vary in terms of the cold ischemic time, the warm ischemic time, and the time to reperfusion of the allograft, whether it be on the OCS system, this NRP model. I'm sorry, this is the new version, the NRP model, and machine perfusion. So what is machine perfusion? So it's pretty crazy. I don't know if any of you guys seen this before, but basically it's a Langendorf. It's like a Langendorf prep model that we would do with mice. But you basically suspend the heart via the aorta, and so blood is perfusing through the aorta to perfuse the coronaries. The heart is not compressed, so there's no load that it has, but it'll just start beating spontaneously. You know, myocardial tissue, the individual cells, as long as you supply them with oxygen, they'll beat. And so here you have a beating heart. We're able to look at it, at least observe the contractile function. And more importantly, we measure lactic acid levels. And as long as the lactic acid levels are not increasing, those tend to be really good hearts. And this is just the setup. There's a reservoir that takes the blood, it gets pumped back through, it gets oxygenated, and then it returns back into the aorta, and then it's drained back again. And so you can stay on this pump for over 6 hours. One of the first cases that we did on our Columbia campus, the team did not know exactly where the OR was, and they showed up with this machine in the outpatient clinic. You know, you just roll up with a heart into the clinic. It's just absurd. But you know, it just affords you a lot more time. And so, you know, some of the surgeons have joked that this allows them to never have to do a transplant at 2 in the morning. You can have a little bit more leisure in deciding the OR time. And that might not be exactly the case. But so there's a randomized controlled trial that was published in 2023 looking at this, comparing patients procured by the OCS system versus the standard donation after brain death. And it was a reasonably sized trial. So 226 patients in the DCD arm versus 71 in the DVD arm. And you can see here, looking at the percentage of patients that were alive at 6 months, there wasn't a lot of difference between the as treated or the overall population, and it was essentially non-inferior for that. And this is also looking at the probability of survival up to 1 year afterwards. And there's no significant difference between those that were procured by OCF versus brain death. So showing at least equivalency between the two models in terms of survival. However, there was an increased risk of primary graft dysfunction. So 15% of the people under the OCS system had severe left ventricular dysfunction versus 5% in the standard brain death arm. And so that's something that we have to contend with. But if we're able to have a person on the transplant list for less time, because this opens up a huge population of patients that previously, or rather a huge population of donors that previously we would not even look at. They weren't even aware to us. And so it gives an opportunity to be transplanted a lot sooner and avoid all the complications that occur while you're waiting for transplant. And just to be very clear about this, the vast majority of people who are transplanted currently in the US, they are in the hospital, usually on an Impella or a balloon pump or on ECMO. And so every day that they're waiting is another day that something bad could happen, and then they're not a candidate for transplant. Now, one of the newest systems, which I'm very excited about, is this hypothermic oxygenated perfusion system. And this is the ex vivo device. This is a concept that was around for a while, at least experimentally in animals, but there wasn't a practical application until just recently. And so in this situation, the heart is not beating and it's cooled within this device, but it's continuously perfused with an oxygenated preservation solution. There is one study that's been published out of Europe. It was published in 2024 in Lancet. And so the primary outcome here is a combination of cardiac death, rejection, and primary graft dysfunction. And the blue line here are the patients in the ex vivo device versus those with the standard cold storage. And in the primary endpoint, there's no significant difference between the two. Okay. But look at the difference in primary graft dysfunction. It is remarkable. So in the HOPE arm, 5% of patients have 5% of patients have PGD versus 20 in the cold storage arm. If this ends up being true, this is the first device that really has been shown to dramatically decrease primary graft dysfunction. And that would be a game changer. Now, we have a clinical trial ongoing currently in the US. We've enrolled a number of patients on this device, and I'm very eager to see what the results of this are going to show. Because not only does this allow us to have a longer ischemic time, but it may actually reduce PGD. France did it's kind of a stunt transplant to my mind. They procured an organ in Martinique and then brought that back to France for a transplant. And that person did really well. Just demonstrated that you could go really, really far and still have a good outcome. It's just a little weird to go to Martinique. I don't know. You wonder about the Martinique people. But anyway, okay. But then one of the questions comes up, is PGD different when PGD occurs in patients that are procured via DCD versus those that are procured via DBD? And this was just a recent publication that looked at it. This is using the data from UNOS, which is a large database in the US. And we looked at primary graft dysfunction in those that died versus DCD versus DBD. And what you'll see is that in the DCD arm, there was a higher incidence of primary graft dysfunction, 9.5% versus 5.1%. But at 72 hours, there was no difference between the two arms, suggesting that even though there's significant PGD early on with DCD, procuring by OCS and these other techniques, it goes away quickly. So maybe it's a little different than the DCD of past. And that led Andreas Zuckerman in Austria and Mandeep Mehra at the Brigham to propose this idea that maybe the modern era of primary graft dysfunction with our new technologies might be a little bit different than the primary graft dysfunction of old. And maybe we should more think of it in the context of the organ just simply recovering from the transplant process. I don't know yet, but clearly there's something different and we need to learn more about it. So now I'm moving on to one of the other real fascinating advances that we've had, and that's the way that we understand rejection and the way that we monitor for rejection. So rejection is obviously bad. You get all these lymphocytes, or sometimes you get antibody deposition within the organ. Usually when we're talking about cellular rejection, we're talking about T cells recognizing foreign HLA proteins. The HLA proteins are the things that define us as unique individuals, at least at a cellular level. So these T cells go around and they can tell when an HLA protein is not their own. And if they see that, they will attack and kill those cells. In contrast, antibody-mediated rejection is when the B cell receptor is presented with antigens by a T helper cell, and that leads to plasma cell secretion of antibodies that go on and attack the cells, form complement deposition, and lead to cell death. So in the past, we had to look for rejection frequently with biopsies. And so a typical biopsy schedule would be to biopsy at week 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 8, then months 3, 4, 5, and 6, then months 8, 10 to 12, and then sometimes intermittently thereafter. And we did it very frequently because the risk of cellular rejection is most prominent within the first 6 months. But having these procedures, it's not exactly comfortable. And importantly, you can have damage to the tricuspid valve. In rare situations, you can poke through maybe the apex, or maybe your bioptome isn't the right place and you puncture through the free wall. And sometimes people just have difficult challenges with access due to thrombosis, and it's costly. So what have we found to avoid this? So the first thing was called gene expression profiling. And this was something that was developed also at New York Presbyterian, or the concept by Mario Dang many years ago. And so basically looking at patterns of gene upregulation in lymphocytes that are associated with rejection. And so basically there's 11 informative genes and 9 control genes, and you're able to calculate a score. And as long as the score was low, there's a good negative predictive value for the absence of moderate rejection. In other words, if we use this and we see that score is low, the likelihood of cellular rejection is such that maybe we don't need to biopsy. So this became prominent in use about 20 years ago and allowed us to decrease the number of transplants, but not completely eliminate them. It's just a risk marker, but doesn't exactly tell us if there's rejection. But the thing that really changed everything is donor-derived cell-free DNA. And in the lecture I'm going to give this afternoon, I'm going to delve into this much more deeply for those of you that can come and join that. But basically, we can measure, everybody's got DNA circulating in your bloodstream, depending on the turnover of cells. But when there's injury to an organ, there's going to be more DNA from that organ in the bloodstream. And we can discriminate between DNA from you versus DNA from a donor organ. And we can look at the percentage of those. And so if the donor fraction of DNA increases in the bloodstream, it indicates that there's a problem. Conversely, if it's low, then it indicates that maybe there's no problem. And so as long as we have a low level of donor-derived cell-free DNA, we can be a little confident that there is no rejection. And so this is an example out of one of the Texas centers looking at survival at 3 years in patients who are surveilled with the gene expression profiling leading to biopsy, or just using gene expression profiling and donor-derived cell-free DNA alone, and only doing a biopsy if those values are both abnormal. And they showed that there was no difference in survival by these two approaches, but significant reduction in biopsies. So we currently only do 4 protocol biopsies. We do it at week 2, week 4, week 8, and week 12. I think we can actually cut that down to just 2 biopsies and get rid of the week 8 and week 12, because at that point, these tests become very viable. And that's very important because it allows the patient to just be monitored from home. We just do home tests. We send a group out to their house, take the blood work. They don't even have to come to clinic. And this is another thing that's very interesting. At our center, we looked at how donor-derived cell-free DNA and gene expression profiling account for risk in patients even when the biopsy is negative. And so we paired these tests with biopsies that showed, at least histologically, that there was no presence of rejection. But in patients who had elevated donor-derived cell-free DNA greater than 0.12 and 0.2%, there was a 4-fold increase in mortality and a 5-fold increase in graft dysfunction. So even in the absence of having histologically verified rejection, these are powerful markers of outcomes. And so this is just a framework that we use at our center, supported by one of the big registries, the SHORE registry, showing as long as the AlloMap, which is the gene expression profiling, and the AlloSure, which is the donor-derived cell-free DNA, are low, the patient is probably going to do fine. You don't need to biopsy. You just need to continue to monitor them as you would typically. And you can see very high negative predictive values for both cellular and antibody-mediated rejection. In contrast, if you have a high AlloMap and high AlloSure, then the risk is much higher, with about a 20% positive predictive value for rejection. Now, we have even more development that's recently happened, which is, this one is super fascinating. This is gene expression profiling at the level of the tissue. So whenever we have suspicion of rejection, meaning the donor-derived cell-free DNA is elevated, and we go for a biopsy, we take a couple of extra tissue samples and we send it for this. This is called molecular microscopy or the molecular microscope. So what do? So you send a sample, you preserve the RNA, and it goes to this laboratory in Toronto, and they isolate everything out, and they look at essentially 50,000 probe sets representing about 20,000 genes that are associated with a wide range of rejection and injury patterns. And they use a machine learning paradigm that's constantly learning from the data that is being returned. And they're able to identify these 4 different archetypes: no rejection, T-cell mediated rejection, antibody mediated rejection, and injury. And this is what a sample looks like. And so you get these probability scores here, looking here at cellular rejection versus antibody-mediated rejection. So in this case, the risk of early stage ABMR versus fully developed ABMR, that's antibody-mediated rejection, comes to a probability of 0.92, so quite high. And this is a visual representation of this. Now, this is a 3-part primary component analysis. So this screen here, if you rotate it 90 degrees, is this screen. So it's a 3-dimensional analysis of where the patient resides. And so, back. Right. So the patient is the triangle, and these are representative conglomerations of all the other patients. And these are the various archetypes that are represented up here. And you can see here that the way it's divided here is that on this side of the axis means there's no rejection, and on this side of the axis, there's rejection. And then if you rotate it 90 degrees, we have antibody-mediated rejection up here, and then cellular rejection here, or antibody rejection here. And so you can see here that this patient looked to be more in the early towards fully developed antibody-mediated rejection. They also give you an assessment of fibrosis of the patient, which can tell you a little bit more about chronic injury. So how good is this? So this is a paper that was released recently. And for those of you who listened before, once again, we have a heart failure research institute where people come from all over the world and do research. This was one of our fellows just this last year. She's published like 15 papers over the year of her doing research. She's actually out of Barcelona, but the point is very productive. So if anybody's looking to do some interesting research, you should look at our program. But Andrea did a really fantastic job. And so this is looking at histologic rejection versus the molecular microscope and dividing it by the presence of antibodies. So we look at donor-specific antibodies, meaning antibodies against HLA proteins of the donor heart. And we see that for MFIs that are really low, that MMDX identified antibody-mediated rejection much more frequently than histology did. In the more severe examples, so the MFI is high, meaning there's a lot of antibodies against donor HLA, that there wasn't quite as much of a difference. And when there was, if we look at it based on histology-defined antibody-mediated rejection, histology picked up more rejection when the antibodies were present. But with MMDX, it picked up antibody-mediated rejection regardless of the antibodies. So what is this to say? This is to say that MMDX is a tool that may identify a different pattern of antibody-mediated rejection and earlier than we might be able to see with histology alone. And this is really important because prior to having these tools, you would see people have progressive graft dysfunction. You would biopsy them. You wouldn't see anything. You would measure the free amount of antibodies in their blood. You wouldn't see anything, but they just were getting worse and you had no idea why. This may shed new light into what's actually happening. Because I don't have time, I'm going to move on to this next bit because I want to get questions. So the point is we continue to develop new techniques in transplant, and the field has continued to progress, which I think is going to improve quality of life of patients and probably even improve survival. Ethical challenges still exist. And we have to be careful when we develop new technical solutions to make sure that the public is well informed and that they are socialized with the comments or the ideas that we have. Our understanding of the immune system remains very limited. We have a lot to learn, but there's probably a lot of progress to be made. Xenotransplantation is a fascinating concept. It's not going to solve everything, but it could solve issues related to organ availability. But we might even come to the point where we can just grow HLA-compatible organs. That's not just pure science fiction. That might be possible. Anyway, this is the Scholars Program that I was talking about, so you can certainly check it out. If y'all want, you can find it on the internet. If you just do Heart Failure Research Institute, NYP, you'll see it. And I also want y'all to know that we have this this app that was an extension of something that I did when I was a fellow, actually, right when the iPhone came out. I was interested in how to disseminate education, but it's a very detailed collection of clinical trials in all forms of heart failure. We have really detailed analyses using all the heart failure faculty at New York Presbyterian, so it's just rich with information. And we also do videos on a range of topics, both surgical and medical. These are with expert panels. This is free, it doesn't cost anything. It's called NYP Advances, so you can download it either from the Google Play Store, iTunes, but it's a real rich
Por los
resource.
medicamentos, los antibióticos.
Thank you. Questions?
Doctor, soy el doctor Ash. No se baje, no se baje. Tengo entendido que habla bien español.
Bueno, como quieran.
A nombre de la Asociación Médica del Centro Médico ABC, le queremos dar la más cordial bienvenida. De veras es impresionante esta plática. Y abrimos el foro para preguntas y comentarios. Tenemos al doctor Riera que quiere hacer un comentario. Por favor, preséntate y haz tu comentario.
Bueno, ya conocí a David, pero soy el doctor Carlos Riera Kinkel. Soy cirujano cardíaco. Hasta hace 15 días estaba a cargo del programa de trasplante cardíaco en el Centro Médico Nacional Siglo XXI. I'm going to say it in English because I think it's absolutely outstanding, your presentation. You have shown us the limits and the frontal lines of cardiac transplantation. And I do have many questions that I might not abuse of the time, but the first thing, what are you using for ischemic time? And I mean, you use Bresch-Schneider solution for cold.
Which solution? What?
Bresch-Schneider solution.
Yeah.
I mean, for the cold. I mean, for the patient, would you do the cardioplegia? Then you extract the heart and then you transfer it. But what do you use before putting into the Sherpa?
The perfuse it, yeah. So, there's probably, there's the Wisconsin solution. There's a variety of different solutions available. We don't really think that there's a big difference between them. There's some data suggest that the different, and this is for standard cold perfusion storage, that there's probably not a big difference. We use Wisconsin, but we also use Del Nido, a Del Nido flush as well. Now the order of it, I have to say, once again, I'm not doing the procurement, so I can't tell you the quantity or the quality thereafter, but I can definitely supply you with that if you'd like to know that.
Well, the fact is the Bresch-Schneider solution reduces leaving all the ATP because it enters into the cetoglutarato and gives the storage of ATP is less. But one of the problems that we have on our patients, because our patients can 200 kilometers from Mexico City, it is absolutely the distance that I can go. I cannot go further. I cannot go to Acapulco because it's 330 kilometers away. So our problem is the ischemic time, and we don't have the Sherpa. But one of the things that I wanted to ask you is the fact of the RB dysfunction on the patients when ischemic time, because the distribution of the coolness of the heart makes the RB more sensitive to damage. What is your opinion since you have lived the two circumstances?
Yeah, look, the RV is always the most susceptible to damage, both in terms of ischemic time, but also in terms of the load that it experiences. So obviously increased pulmonary vascular resistance at any level, increased left atrial pressure at any level, all of these things will lead to right ventricular damage. And so we are, more than anything else, I mean, obviously when you get LV dysfunction, that's going to be something that is going to occupy our attention. But much more frequently, it's just RV dysfunction. And so the approach is to make sure that we are protecting the right ventricle as much as possible. So if, for example, immediately before coming off bypass, we start them on inhaled nitric oxide at 40 parts per million, just to lower the pulmonary vascular resistance as much as possible. We keep the oxygen levels high enough to avoid any hypoxic mediated pulmonary vasoconstriction. As much as possible, we keep the right atrial pressure as low as possible and make sure that we are supporting at a minimum with good inotropic support, if not mechanical support. And if we get a sense that the RV is struggling too much, we have a very low threshold for putting them on some form of mechanical circulatory support. We don't tend to use like an RV impella because we don't want to cause damage to the pulmonic or the tricuspid valve. But if it's too bad, sometimes we'll even do a right atrial to pulmonic cannulation and just maintain enough inotropes to ensure that the RV is getting emptied. But look, it's a risk for a variety of reasons. And obviously, the longer the ischemic time, the more likely you're going to have that problem. You know, in New York, we're at a little bit of a disadvantage because of where the airport is. So in New York, Presbyterian, you have two centers. You've got Columbia and Cornell. Columbia is very close to Teterboro Airport. And they don't have to traverse Manhattan. But to get to Cornell, you've got to traverse Manhattan. And depending on the time of the day, it's actually quite rough. And so our average ischemic time at Cornell is around 4.5 hours. So it's already quite long. But with super careful management of the heart, you can get them through it. Yeah. And our survival rates show it. So our 1 year survival is about 95 to 97%. So we have very few patients that die.
And on the beating heart system, do you have a measurement of lactate on the right atrium?
Yeah, you monitor, and so they actually will send us the lactate in the airplane the whole way through. So we get 15-minute updates on what the lactate is doing, and if we see that going in the wrong direction, we can decline.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. David. I have a question for one of our interventional cardiologists about the vascular disease in the long term. We were talking about of the role of coronary angiography and the IBUS, but I think you made a very important comment yesterday about the role of PET-CT in the follow-up of these patients.
Yeah, and this is an area that we didn't even touch on, which is cardiac allograft vasculopathy. So one of the long-term causes of donor death or recipient death and graft loss is a development of a predominantly immune-mediated concentric disease of the coronary arteries that is probably because of antibody deposition and other things, although maybe cholesterol plays some role. So we monitor for it. And so the way we monitor for it is by doing coronary angiography with IVUS early on. And if we see plaque formation by IVUS, then we will usually transition to an mTOR inhibitor, which may help to reduce that formation. But we alternate between cardiac PET-CT. The cardiac PET-CT gives us insight into both macro and microvascular dysfunction that you wouldn't see on angiography and with IVUS alone. So the two are complementary, and we use both. And we know that utilizing both, and we've published on this, helps to improve prognostication of what's going to happen with the patients.
Thank you, David. Voy a darte las gracias en español. Ayer David habla perfecto español, pero gracias no solamente por este excelente talk, por todo lo que va alrededor del trasplante cardíaco, sino que ayer pasó con nosotros en la unidad coronaria, con nuestros Cardiology Fellows, en el Centro de Simulación de Santa Fe, y la verdad es que esta cercanía en la enseñanza es lo que más deja. Gracias por compartir tu experiencia, gracias por venir a México y esperemos que verte pronto otra vez aquí con nosotros.
Gracias. Es mi placer.
Gracias.
Como pueden ver, ya la gente en Santa Fe ya se nos fue. No tuvimos chance de que ellos hicieran preguntas y comentarios. Todavía en el chat hay un comentario, Juan Carlos de la Fuente. El uso de inmunosupresión libre de esteroides, ¿qué es lo que usan?
Sí, bueno, utilizamos los esteroides por como 6 meses, pero poco a poco estamos disminuyendo el dosis de prednisona. La mayoría de los pacientes están libres de prednisona después de 6 meses. Y desde luego utilizamos tacrolimus con mycophenolate. A veces cambiamos a otros inmunosupresantes como belatacept o los mTOR inhibitors como rapamycin o everolimus.
Bueno, pues nuevamente muchísimas gracias. Le haremos llegar su carta de reconocimiento por esta sesión. Como ves, nuestra principal sesión. La semana que entra tenemos otra vez enfermedades raras con la doctora Alma Medrano Hernández. El curso para este fin de semana, hoy en la noche tenemos una sesión de arte combinada con cirugía. Los invitamos a las 7 de la noche, ya sea aquí en el auditorio o por Zoom. El fin de semana que entra vamos a tener, en 3 semanas vamos a tener el curso de FCCS de recursos limitados. Es muy interesante este curso para los países del tercer mundo. El tratamiento de trauma facial también para el 20 y 21 de marzo. Y recuerden, el 16 de mayo tenemos la carrera, caminata del Centro Médico ABC en el Parque Aztlán, salida y llegada por el Parque Aztlán. Pasen a la asociación a inscribirse y este es el QR cuando quieran proponer algún curso para registrarlo y que lo podamos realizar en conjunto con la Asociación Médica. Muchas gracias.